So we'll go to our first text then, which is from the Hebrew Bible. And I'm going to ask Rabbi Jason to read this and then introduce what he'd like to say about it.
Thank you very much, Alistair. So as you can see, we're reading from Genesis chapter 1, verses 26, 28. And God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. They shall rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle, the whole earth, and all the creeping things that creep on earth." God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them. God said to them, "Be fertile and increase, fill the earth and master it, and rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and all the living things that creep on earth." What's the importance of this text in the Jewish tradition? Very, very simple. It is telling us what it means to be human. What are we learning from the text? And of course, I've already said, and you can see on the screen, it's from the book of Genesis. So what's the context here? Creation. And the culmination, the final part of creation was us human beings, everything built up to us. What this teaches us in Judaism is that God created the world for human beings to have a place to live and to make a very special place. How relevant this is, given that we've just had the COP26 conference going on, the concerns about climate change. We affect the world. We have a level of power which is greater than any other creature. And that's what's meant by the opening line. God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." Meaning that although all creation comes from God, human beings, although we are not God, and we have to remember we're not God, there are limits on what we can do, but we are closer to God than any other creature and have more power than any other creature, because we have the ability to determine what type of world we are going to live in. We can actually make decisions that will affect the progress of the world, looking after our environment, ecology. God forbid, when we don't behave as we should and we start wars, we destroy the world. No other creature has the power that human beings have to determine what kind of world we are going to live in. And that's why the text goes on to say, "They shall rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle, the whole earth." So we have an impact, more than an impact, we have a responsibility for all of the life around us. We have to look after it, take care of it, utilize it properly. And then if you look at verse 27, here's an interesting one about a dimension of humanity. God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. We've already had this idea of being created in God's image and spoken a little bit about how we can make decisions in a way that God does. Because we are creative, we can make things, and we have the power not only to make things, but to make plans and to come up with ideas, and we have faculties that no other creatures have. But then it says, male and female, he created them. 1 minute it's talking about God creating man, he created him, halfway through verse 27, before the semicolon. Then it says, male and female, he created them. In Jewish tradition, this teaches us something very interesting. According to Jewish tradition, the first human being was both male and female equally, as one being. I think they call it androgynous, one being, male and female. And then it says, male and female, he created them. You may be familiar with the story of Adam. This is before we even read about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. This is the introduction to human beings being created. And we're told that that first human being was lonely. That first human being didn't have another creature with whom that being could communicate with in a meaningful way. And therefore, according to Jewish tradition, God split that human being into two. male and female, so that their humanity, male and female, would be of the same species, but there would be differences between them whereby each could learn something from the other that the other didn't have. So the first human being was created alone, and we go on to read in the text how Adam tries to understand the different creatures in the world, but they're too unlike him to have a meaningful relationship, and he's lonely. God splits the human being into male and female so that female and male can learn from one another and give qualities to each other that each individually they do not have. That is how we understand verse 27. The final verse, God blessed them and God said to them, be fertile and increase. So it's our job in the world to look after the whole world and not simply be in one area of the world. So really, the way the world should be is not that there's the developed world and the underdeveloped world. We should all be able to make sure that everybody is able to be successful in whatever part of the world they should be in, both in terms of population, in terms of use of resources. But we know we live in the world where there are richer nations and poorer nations. And what we see from verse 28 is that's not really the way it's supposed to be. We should all be able to share the world and fill the world, all of us, in a way that makes us equally benefiting from it and equally taking care of it and mastering it and making sure it's productive, food for all, and there is provision for all. Be fertile and increase, fill the earth and master it, rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and all the living things that creep on earth. So let's hope that the recent COP26, which brought together nations of the world to look at our collective responsibility, continues to fulfill these very important instructions and responsibilities given to us at the very beginning of the Bible. So those are my thoughts and presentation on this text. I think I'm back to Alistair now, do I, for sharing?
Thank you, Jason. Yes, that's great. Thank you. So we're going to hear from each of our presenters in turn, and then throw it open to any questions. So I noticed we have some others joining us from up at Batley High School. If you can please just rename yourself with that. I think there's quite a few there. So if you can rename yourself with your school as well as your name, and just send me a message, one of the teachers, if there's any difficulty. We've still got a couple in the waiting room. So we're going to move on now to George and to our Christian text, which is from St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. So we'll just move the slide on now and we can see it on the screen. George, good morning. And
good morning.
I think I'm going to read this to start with, aren't I? So I'll read it out and then we'll hand over to you in a second. St. Paul writes, it is sown a physical body, it is raised a spiritual body. If there is a physical body, there is also a spiritual body. Thus it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. But it's not the spiritual that is first, but the physical, and then the spiritual. The first man was from the earth, a man of dust. The second man is from heaven. As was the man of dust, so are those who are of the dust. And as is the man of heaven, so are those who are of heaven. Just as we have borne the image of the man of dust, we will also bear the image of the man of heaven. So, George, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for reading that, Alistair. Interesting, just to point out there that, of course, we have a discussion of Adam here, or reference to Adam, as indeed, of course, we had in the Hebrew scripture, and we heard of the creation of the first Adam. I want to just put this passage in context, really. It's part of St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. Paul was a great missionary of the early church. By that I mean he travelled to explain, to bring to people the Christian message and to create communities that followed Christ. So he was very influential in establishing in what you might think of as the eastern end of the Mediterranean, in that part of the world. He was very influential in establishing Christian communities. They were usually called followers of the way. What he did after he left these communities was then to keep in touch with them by letter. And we have in the Christian Bible quite a few of his letters to the communities he had visited and helped establish. And sometimes he writes to them as a sort of feedback, really, from the messages that he's getting from other people who have gone to visit those communities. And there are particular points where the communities perhaps need further help and guidance as to what Christianity is all about and how it means, what it means for Paul, at least. So Corinth, he'd been to Corinth and he had established a collection of Christian followers there. Corinth at that time was a big seaport. Of course, it still exists in Greece, and it's in that part of Greece where the mainland, as it were, joins the Peloponnese. It's a great crossing point, a point where people meet together from different parts of the Eastern Mediterranean world, meet together for commerce, for trade. There would have been a great mixture of cultures and faiths. It's on the edge, if you like, of the old Greek world, and very much in touch with the Roman Empire. So a lot of a big melting pot, really, of all sorts of different influences and ideas. And I think what we have in this passage here is Paul struggling with trying to establish what is distinctly Christian amongst all perhaps the different sort of ideas about what it is to be a person and what the spiritual life is about, if you like. Paul, I think, is struggling with the concept of the body and the soul. He talks about the created being, the creature that is of the dust, and talks about the spiritual being, the person who is in Christ, who is following their faith, and who has a spiritual destiny. And I think what he's perhaps trying to do here is to separate out the Greek ideas from Christian ideas. Greeks generally believed that the soul was freed from the body at the time of death. And Paul is saying here that yes, of course, we have a physical body, but there is also a life-giving spirit in that, as we see in verse 45. And the two are not divisible, though. You can't hive off one from the other. And I suspect that this was a response to behavior in Corinth, where people thought that what they did in their bodies didn't necessarily affect what was going to happen to them after death. But Paul is saying what happens in the body affects how you are and your spiritual destiny, if you like, because what you do in the body affects the soul. The two are one. By becoming a Christian, you change your status. You become part of that second Adam that he talks about. You change your status and you become somebody who is already sharing in the spiritual life, and your body becomes a temple of the Spirit. So it raises questions for us, it seems to me today, about if I'm a person of faith, how is that perceived by others? it affects my behavior and how I want to use the life that is given to me, and how I regard my body and see it indeed as a temple of the Spirit where God dwells. But how is it perceived as such by others? And I think in the world today, that's quite a real issue, because of course we are surrounded by secularism, where people are not concerned about spiritual matters, or don't believe that we have a spiritual identity other than what is often understood, I think, in quite general terms as a vague feeling of belonging to something greater than us, a life force, a life spirit or something. But if I'm a person of faith, how does that actually manifest itself to others, and how do I understand it for myself? We are told in our tradition that feelings are not everything. If I don't feel the presence of God in my life, it doesn't mean that God isn't there and part of my life. If I say my prayers and spend time in meditation, I may not feel that anything is happening very much, but we're encouraged to persevere, to keep going, because we do it in the knowledge or the hope that God is there sustaining us, whether we feel that or not. If I go to the church, and this is something that people often cast up against us, are we any different from people who don't go to church, who don't practice their faith in a shared, open way? Well, often we fall back, of course, we sin, we are often appearing not to be very different from others, and yet what difference does that make to us, and how are our lives in God blessed and benefited by our attendance in corporate religion? So there's all kinds of issues that Paul is struggling with. I might say it's a passage that I think a lot of Christian ministers do struggle with, and it's often given as something to be read at funerals, but a lot of us are a bit wary of doing it because we can get a bit admired in all of the issues around there. So I hope I've given you some sort of understanding or background to that text and the questions that it raises for me.
Thank you, George. And I guess one of the key things that comes out of that is the distinction between physical body and spirit or soul, if you like, which we might come back to in discussion. Is there a distinction, and what does it mean to be something more than the combination of chemicals and DNA that we are, that makes us human beings? So that sense of identity. So Maysoon,
thank you. Very well put. Yes. Okay.
We'll come to Maysoon now, if we may, and our third, final in this section, thinking about the created human, and reading from the Quran, and for asking Maysoon there to just put in some of her thoughts on the passage that's now on the screen. So good morning, Maysoon.
Thank you. Thank you. So I will be reading from the Quran, chapter 39, verse number 6. So if anyone is familiar with the Quran, it is Surah Al-Zumar, which is translated to the troops. So let's start off. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. He created you all from a single being, from which he made its mates. He gave you 4 kinds of livestock in pairs. He creates you in your mother's wombs in one stage after another, in threefold depth of darkness. Such is God, your Lord. He holds control. There is no God but him. How can you turn away? If you are ungrateful, remember, God has no need of you, yet he is not pleased by ingratitude in his servants. If you are grateful, he is pleased to see it in you. No soul will bear another's burden. You will return to your Lord in the end, and he will inform you of what you have done. He knows well what is in the depths of your heart. So from this, we can see quite quickly that it's a confirmation of science. What we see in society today, in biology, we all learn in our biology lessons that we have been created in stages. The Quran is confirming this. So we understand that the Quran is saying that you've been created in stages. Biology is also saying the same. first you're created as a drop, so that's your semen fluid, then you're produced into a clot, then a piece of flesh before you are born. So that's 3 stages. That's 3 stages of your creation, how you are created. If we go into the second stage of the first verse of verse 6, the reference here is made to threefold depths of darkness. When you're created in your wombs, that is referring to the darkness of the mother's belly. Then it's referring to the darkness of the womb itself. Then it's referring to the darkness of the placenta. So the image, the vision that is being portrayed here is that you are placed in 3 folds of darkness before you even see the light of day, before you are even born. So this is the way that we are told and portrayed the vision of creation, how it's created. The verse goes on to say that God is in no need. He's in no need of us. He informs us, first of all, that he's created us, but then he is telling us that he's free from need. So if we are to, as Muslims, act as good Muslims and do good, we're only doing good for our better self. If we go astray and start following the evil path and start doing things which are untowards the religion, then we are only doing that against ourselves as well. So this is what God is referring to when he says every soul will be informed of what they have done. So the belief of Muslims is that there is a day of resurrection, we will be resurrected, and we will be asked and questioned on that day of all our actions we have done whilst we have been alive. So this is why in Muslims, it's always said it's a peaceful religion. Islam is a peaceful religion because we are expected to not only look after ourselves, beautify ourselves, look after our own body, spiritually and physically, but we have a duty to all our neighbors, we have a duty to the community. And if we go on further, it says that no soul will bear a burden of another. So sometimes if we're in trouble, we kind of look to our mum, we kind of look to our friends, we look to our peers. If we're in trouble, can you please help us out? Here, God is telling you that on that day, the day of resurrection, you will not be able to bear a burden of another. So if someone else has wronged another, you will be bearing the burden of that yourself and the individual. So each for their own here. On the day of resurrection, everyone will be questioned in their own entity, and you'll be asked questions about you, how you lived your life. So if we can see the verse in the Quran here in chapter 39, verse number 6 and 7, it's very progressive. It's telling you first how you were created, how biology is telling you, it's confirming that you are created in 3 stages, and then you're born. This is what the darkness is referring to. So when you're born, and it's telling you then when you are in this life, how you are supposed to live it, because then when you do return to your creator, you will be questioned about everything you do, and you can't hide. This is quite evident from the last verse, because it's saying he knows. Who is he? He is referring to God. He knows well what is in the depths of your heart. So sometimes you might do something and think, no one's watching, I can get away with this. No, he knows every action you do. He knows every action you're taking, and he knows what you're thinking before you've even said it. He knows what you want to say without you even uttering it from your mouth. So this is what it's referring to, that he knows what's in the depths of your hearts, and you will be questioned. Accountability here is key. So the key message is always try and stay on the path of truth and remain steadfast in everything that you do.
Soon, thank you very much. I apologise for the phone going just at the beginning then, with an emergency line in case people can't get on. Thank you. Thank you very much. And obviously the word that came through to me from your presentation there was one about responsibility, and particularly individual direct accountability for our actions in general, but in this set for creation in particular. So thank you to all 3 of our guests there. What we've said is that there's a chance now to ask any questions or to unpack anything you might want to, in particular how it relates students to your own studies and to GCSE or the other things you're studying in religious education, how those teachings from these three great world faiths apply to our knowledge and understanding in class. So if you've got any questions, feel free to put those in the chat. I'm going to ask Jake if he has a question he'd like to put to get us going, just about applying it to that. And I've got one or two as well, but please feed them into the chat as well if you have them from the floor.
So all of these texts, I guess, link to the value of human life. And there's a number of issues that we study at GCSE, and sometimes other schools choose to spread these topics across, whereby we might want to refer to that. And my class presently are going to be moving on to abortion very shortly. So I just wondered if we could look at how we would link these passages to your faith perspectives on an issue such as abortion. And moreover, if you could maybe point out what might be a very useful specific quote, because obviously we couldn't quote the entire passage, from these sections that our students could look at learning, memorizing and taking to an exam. And it might be good, Maysoon, if we start with yourself, seeing as we've got the passage from the Quran up there.
That's fine. Thank you very much for your question, Jake. It's a very interesting question, and sometimes it's seen as a taboo topic, in all honesty. Abortion is something that everybody wants to kind of steer away from. But from an Islamic point of view, life is seen as a sanctity. It's seen as a gift from God, so we can't just take it as we will. If life has so much creation, so much talk of it in the Quran, we need to understand that it's a gift from God. Every breath that we take is a gift from God. But on the same token, God is giving, God is loving, and he knows and he understands that there are situations sometimes where women may be put under undue distress by giving birth. And in certain situations where there's a medical reason and the medical doctors have certified it, if it falls within the 4-month ambit, the 4-month rule, then it is permissible to take an abortion. But if it doesn't fall within the 4 months, 120 days of gestation, as it refers to in the Quran, then that is not permissible.
Wonderful. And if we were looking at a quotation there, it might be that we take that section there, "He creates you in your mother's womb," would be a nice quote to be able to take for GCSE, or potentially the end one for what you said there at the end, "He knows well what is in the depths of your hearts." Absolutely. So again, you know, our schools have copies of these, and it might be that your students, if you've got your own copies, maybe want to highlight those sections. If we could take the same question and send that to Rabbi Jason, if you wouldn't mind.
Yes, it's virtually identical, as Maysoon has said, from the Jewish position. And just the key there is God created man. So we are God's creatures. We don't have the right to say that a creature doesn't have a right to life. And therefore, picking up what Maysoon said, where there is, God forbid, danger to the mother, which would compromise her life. So at what point is the fetus seen as a being independent from the mother? Yeah. So underlying all of this is the sanctity of human life. So the only reason why we would sanction abortion would be if the life of while the fetus is still inside the mother, the life is the mother. Where it gets interesting is if at the point at which, let's say, the mother is giving birth, okay, if the baby has not yet emerged and giving birth will cause the mother to die, you'd be in a position even then to save the mother's life. If that meant, let's say there was a situation where the baby is causing some kind of blockage and the mother's life will be compromised. The moment the baby is an entity in his or her own right, you can't do that. Now that's a new life in of itself in this world. And therefore that baby you can't, even to save the mother at that point, you wouldn't be able to do that if the baby's now seen as an entity in his own right or her own right. So the fact that the idea that creation is ultimately in the hands of God and life is in the hands of God is very much at the heart of Jewish tradition. And this obviously is clearly stated in the idea that God created man. It's not for us to create or destroy other human beings.
Fantastic. Could I just clarify, Rabbi Jason? Just you used the word emerge there, and obviously when the life is a life in and of itself. So, just for our students, obviously some people talk about viability or the viability of the fetus if it's able to survive in and of itself. That will be distinct from whether it has emerged. So, could you clarify what you mean by the term to emerge?
What I meant there was in relation if the baby is causing a danger to the mother's life, only in that context. Yeah. So in other words, up until there's no question that all things being equal, abortion not allowed under any circumstances. Only if there is a threat to the mother's life. What we're trying to ascertain is how far does that go? At what point? Clearly, the way my son put it, while the baby's in the mother's belly, part of the mother. Yeah. Okay. At the point that the key is, if let's say the mother's about to give birth, it's causing complications for the mother, and the only way you're going to save the mother's life, the way one of the rabbinic teachings, sorry to put it so bluntly, is even if it meant, removing limb from limb, so to speak. Yeah.
So full term.
Yeah, full term. If it meant the mother will die. Okay, only in that context. Okay, otherwise you would not be allowed it anyway, even if the baby hasn't emerged to compromise that baby's life. We're talking about where one life it may be compromised by the other. That's the issue here. So what we're saying is that up until the baby emerges, okay, anything to save the mother's life. The moment that is a viable being in this world, you have to make sure that being can live, even if then that will cause the mother harm.
Brilliant. Thank you for that clarification. And again, the verse for our students might be that we take, and God created man. And there's a lovely section afterwards, in his image. So we're seen as image bearers, image bearers of the Creator. Hence that life has value. And we were saying there from the point where it can be a life in and of itself, independent from the mother. So thank you so much for that, Rabbi Jason. We have got a question for you, but if we perhaps go to George first and then go back, Alistair, that might be the best way to do it, just to ensure flow of discussion. So if I could go to George to do the same thing there with the Corinthians passage, which I'll just bring up for you.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if I've got a huge amount to add to what others have said ahead of me. It is a hotly contested issue within different Christian communities. And in particular, there's a very strong anti-abortion lobby, if you want to put it like that, in the Roman Catholic Church. But I think a lot of us would agree with the teaching that a life comes into being at conception. And I have a job with this Corinthians passage because it kind of posits that divinity comes in the future. The divine spark comes in the future. You could read it like that. The first verse, for example, it is sown a physical body, it is raised a spiritual body. But many of us would maintain that the divine spark comes in God's gift of life to the baby at conception. So abortion is therefore not acceptable, except in some of the very extreme medical cases that the others have spoken of, i.e. risk to the mother. Also, I suppose when I was a hospital chaplain, we did quite a lot of funerals for babies that died during pregnancy, and they either died of natural causes or because they weren't sustainable, or there were problems with the fetus, which meant that were the fetus to be born, it would have no viability at all. So there were medical terminations, medical abortions, if you like, of the fetus before they came to full term. We gave them funerals because we honoured these little fetuses as lives and as being in the image and likeness of God and precious. Of course, they were precious to the families, and a cause of great sadness and sorrow to them that they had died during pregnancy. But I think that does illustrate the significance, the importance of the fetus and the way that we viewed them as being people in their own right, little people in their own right. So I guess the text that you might want is, there is also a spiritual body, in verse 44 there, that we see life as being divinely given and therefore to be honoured.
Thank you very much, George. We're coming to the end of our time, but I'm just looking at the questions there from Madni. Thank you for these questions. So I think we can all see them on your chat bar there. So a couple of questions to Rabbi Jason about what was the name of given to the first person created? Did that being become Adam and Eve after it got split? And the further question about humans are the most superior on earth. Who controls the earth, humans or God? Which is a very kind of deep question, isn't it? And the word mastery and ruling, which are in the Hebrew Bible passage there, obviously can be misinterpreted or interpreted in certain ways. Rabbi Jason, do you want to comment on those comments briefly, on those questions briefly?
Yeah. So the first one, the Hebrew word Adam actually means the ground. Yeah? So God breathes, we have the image of God and breathes life into this earthly being. And therefore Adam actually means humanity. So, you know, often we have this idea of man is that to do with masculine. It's the same man as in humanity, woman, man, etc. So that first being is Adam, referring to male and female as one entity. It's only when it's actually Adam who gives Eve her name, mother of all life, after the split between them. Yeah. So the first human being is Adam, and that would be the English translation, would be humanity, the common humanity that we all share. The answer to the second question is very simple. It's a partnership. Yeah. The idea of being made in the image of God, and towards the end of the creation narrative, it says, and God sanctified the world and the world that he'd made for human beings to do with him. Okay, so human beings and God are in a partnership. Obviously the main partner is God, but God has invested us, which also means in the image of God, to carry out what God wants us to do by the instructions he gives us as to how the world should be. So when we speak about control in that sense, it's not that God controls in the sense of that we have no free will and that we are cowering, and on the contrary, God empowers us to work with him to run the world with him.
Thank you very much. And finally, and we are just a minute, George, if you can have a look at the question there about what happens to the soul after death. We are very tight for time, but it's a big question to look at. But can you give us a little bit of insight on that? What happens to the soul after death, and what do Christians believe? It's basically about Christian beliefs about life after death. Yeah.
Right. I think we see inklings of what we are to be in ourselves and in others, and they become set free after death. I can't tell you how exactly that is, but I believe that we remain ourselves with our own identity. We are set free from the constraints of an earthly body, from pain, from time, aging, and all the rest. And our essential core prevails, is raised up, and shares God's glory forever.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much to everyone. We've obviously not done justice to a huge topic, but I think the three of you have done an enormous contribution to helping us to understand it, and to linking that to some of the texts that our students are studying on this theme of creation. So we're really grateful to you.